Myth 3. Buying and banking black will close the racial wealth gap. In his famed 1968 speech, I've Been to the Mountaintop, Martin Luther King Jr. called for a bank-in movement. To assert black independence, King called on his followers to strengthen black institutions by taking your money out of the banks downtown and deposit your money in Tri-State Bank, a black-owned bank. This idea that buying and banking from black-owned businesses will empower the black community and close the racial wealth gap has been widely embraced, historically by a diverse array of Americans, including Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, Richard Nixon, and, recently, by the hashtag #BankBlack movement. From this perspective, if only black consumers would invest in their own communities, turning inward for solutions to their economic woes, rather than asking the state for a handout, they would become economically self-sufficient and eventually thrive. After all, the premise works as follows. A group with a low profile of achievement does not have to persuade members of the dominant group to embrace policies to repair the outgroup that may impose costs on the dominant group. Everything ultimately can be solved internally with the right amount of spit and polish. Rather than creating an inclusive and just economy that does not greatly disadvantage a group solely based on their race, politicians across the aisle embrace the idea of buying and banking black. In 1968, the same year King called for a bank-in, none other than presidential hopeful Richard Nixon came out endorsing black capitalism. In his speech to the Republican National Convention, Nixon proclaimed, "Instead of government jobs and government housing and government welfare, let government use its tax and credit policies to enlist in this battle against poverty, the greatest engine of progress ever developed in the history of man, American private enterprise." Black capitalism, in Nixon's eyes, was the solution. So while white America received ample government support through public policies to build and maintain wealth, black Americans were offered a deficient private sector strategy. Black capitalism was a solution that would allow the government to hand over the economic problems of poverty and insufficient wealth in the black community to the community itself, effectively ridding the government of responsibility. But black businesses and banks cannot thrive on a separate and unequal playing field. For instance, in the U.S., black banks are smaller and less profitable than similar white institutions. This is not because the black-owned institutions lack a strong business model or viable leaders, but because of the economic situation of the communities where they operate and their own disparate levels of access to startup and developmental finance. For instance, since black families have minimal liquid wealth, their bank accounts tend to hold money for day-to-day and week-to-week expenses. Small and unstable deposits, due to continued economic penalties forced upon black workers and households, makes profitability a significant challenge for these banks. In the end, if black banks and businesses are a supposed solution to the racial wealth gap, we must address a basic math problem that arises. To close the gap, black banks and enterprises must earn a much higher rate of return than white businesses. Without this condition being met, the gap only will be perpetuated rather than ended. What is the state of black business in the United States today? A recent report by the Association for Enterprise Opportunity indicates that 2.58 million U.S. black-owned businesses only generate $150 billion in revenue. Unfortunately, this represents negligible ownership and control over the nation's productive capacity. For instance, in 2016, the top 100 black-owned firms identified by Black Enterprise collectively grossed $24 billion and employed 73,940 workers. In contrast, Walmart, the top firm by revenue in the U.S., grossed more than 20 times as much in revenue and employed 2.2 million more workers than the entire top 100 black-owned firms combined in the same year. In fact, Walmart, the largest private employer in the U.S., generates more revenue than all 2.58 million black-owned businesses combined. Black-owned banks also are minuscule in the context of the general scale of American banking. The largest 5 black-owned banks recently were estimated to have assets totaling $2.3 billion, while J.P. Morgan alone had an estimated $2 trillion in assets. Thus, the top 5 black banks' assets were a tiny 0.1% of Morgan's assets. This indicates that the existing infrastructure of black-owned banks lacks the capacity to produce wide and substantial increases in black wealth. Even if they were to double, triple, or quadruple their assets, black banks would not be major players on the American economic landscape, never mind the global landscape. Moreover, since black wealth is so low in the first place, it is a mere fantasy to anticipate that the existing black consumer base could build a black-owned equivalent of J.P. Morgan by banking black. Indeed, the illusion that blacks have the capacity to build a separate, major economy is perpetuated by the oft-repeated observation that black Americans possess $1.2 trillion in buying power that, allegedly, has been misspent thus far. Jared Ball has advanced the following potent deconstruction of this contemporary cliché. 1. The claim that black America has roughly $1 trillion in buying power is popularly repeated mythology with no basis in sound economic logic or data. While the myth has a longer history, it is today largely propelled by misreadings and poor, false interpretations of Nielsen surveys and marketing reports. 2. Buying power is a marketing phrase that refers only to the power of consumers to purchase what are strictly available goods and is used as a measurement for corporations to better market their products. Power here has nothing to do with actual economic strength, and there is no collective $1+ trillion that black people have and just foolishly spent ignorantly to their economic detriment. 3. The myth of buying power functions as propaganda, working to deny the reality of structural, intentional, and necessary economic inequality required to maintain society as it is, one that benefits an increasingly decreasing number of people. Note also, even if we accept the estimated $1.2 trillion total of black buying power as valid, it still is only 60% of the value of J.P. Morgan's total assets. A strategy for closing the racial wealth gap currently in popular circulation is to have each one of the nation's 40 million black Americans contribute $10 a month, $120 a year, to a fund to support black-owned banks who, in turn, will finance further development of black-owned businesses. But the total amount of that fund would only come to $4.8 billion, a tiny speck in America's overall wealth and national income. The key to assisting black businesses in their development and growth lies in leveling the terrain of racial wealth differences and increasing black entree to startup and developmental capital in the first place. Prior research has confirmed that individuals with access to family wealth both directly through transfers from immediate family members and indirectly through kin networks have markedly higher rates of entrepreneurship and are more likely to start larger businesses. More than 2 decades ago, Timothy Bates found that individuals with relatively high levels of education and at least $100,000 in net worth were the persons most likely to undertake self-employment. But today, the median black household's net worth is 1/10 of the threshold figure for successful entry advanced by Bates in 1995. While some may argue that the wealthy tend to make better entrepreneurs, Evans and Jovanovic argue strongly that the data reject this explanation and that the levels of capital required to start businesses systematically exclude non-wealthy individuals, regardless of their entrepreneurial talent. Thus, with the denial of black wealth accumulation and with the continued exclusion of blacks from business credit markets, blacks simply do not have access to the necessary resources to build corporations that can be players in a global economy. A black American corporate monolith cannot be built on $1.2 trillion in spending capacity, never mind $4.8 billion in seed capital. Mirza Baradaran forcefully argues that buying black, banking black, is a stance that is symptomatic of an attraction to the chimerical dream of black capitalism. She contends that, again, in the absence of a wide, deep, and independent foundation in wealth among black Americans, the prospect of a world of giant black-owned corporations is no more than a fantasy. Baradaran's central conclusion is capitalism, whether black or white, cannot fix problems created by racialized public policies. We must make it clear that we have no objection to banking black or buying black. In the interest of black solidarity, the idea has great merit. But the failure to bank black or buy black does not explain why we have a racial wealth gap of this magnitude, nor will banking black or buying black do much to reduce the gap.